Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me? I think you can. I think I can hear myself. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It rained. Let's all clap for that, I guess. My name is Kirsten Marples, and I'm Curatorial Associate here at the Manil Drawing Institute and curator of the current exhibition, Hyperreal Gray Foy. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening for our program, a lecture by Dr. Robert Cozzolino on the work and career of the singular, tremendously talented, yet somewhat overlooked American artist, Gray Foy. Tonight's lecture has been organized to coincide with the exhibition, which is the first solo museum exhibition devoted to Foy's meticulous and imaginative drawings. If you haven't yet had the chance to visit the show and linger over the drawings with one of the magnifying glasses we are providing, you still have time to do so. The show is, however, closing next week on September 3rd, which is really hard for me to believe. Hyperreal Gray Foy celebrates two recent gifts of Foy's drawings, which have made the Manil collection the foremost repository of the artist's work. Drawn primarily from these new acquisitions and including select loans from public and private collections, this exhibition spans Foy's career from the 1940s to the 1970s. For anyone interested in learning more about Gray Foy's drawings after the lecture, an excellent monograph was published in 2018 by Don Quaintance, and thanks to the generosity of an anonymous donor, we're able to give a copy to everyone in attendance tonight. So they will be available at the front desk as you exit. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Robert Cozzolino. Robert Cozzolino is the Patrick and Aimee Butler Curator of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where he has worked since 2016. Before joining MIA, he was the senior curator and Evelyn and Will Kaplan Curator of Modern Art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. Born and raised in Chicago, he studied at the University of Illinois at Chicago before receiving his master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Robert has curated over 60 exhibitions and authored many publications, including Supernatural America, The Paranormal in American Art from 2021, World War I and American Art from 2016, Peter Blume, Nature and Metamorphosis from 2014, and David Lynch, The Unified Field, also from 2014. It was Robert's championing of underrepresented artists and overlooked narratives that initially brought me to his work, in particular, his book on Peter Blume, an artist whom Gray Foy exhibited alongside in New York. And when I approached Robert about our exhibition and about giving this talk, he responded enthusiastically, "I love Gray Foy's work." So my sincere hope is that everyone leaves tonight with the same level of genuine interest and passion for this artist and his remarkable artworks. So before I welcome Dr. Cozzolino to the podium, I'd like to remind you to kindly silence your cell phones. I'll do that myself. We are recording this program, and it should be made available on the Manil's YouTube channel before too long. Please also hold your questions until the end of the presentation, at which point Robert will welcome audience questions, and my colleague Tony will come around with a microphone. Now, please join me in welcoming Robert Cozzolino.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody at the Manil, for having me here. Yes, I nerdily responded that I love Gray Foy, and I'm so glad to see the work in person. When the show happened in 2018 at Francis Nauman in New York, I wasn't able to see it, but that monograph is spectacular, so y'all got a great door prize. Whatever I say here, or however this goes, you're getting something out of the evening. Where am I? What do I see? What do I feel? Does seeing change me? Does it change what I see? How many ways can I see what is before me? It seems to shift and change shape, substance, each time I blink, lose focus, or let go of naming. Radiating fields, vibrations, waves, something is here and it is moving, living, and trying to make contact. A molecular labyrinth, slow growth tendrils curling before my sight, turning and waving, calling my minute attention, pointing soft tips to open me, expanding my body. A sensation like a deep breath that pulls the world through me like a tiny river in whirlpool. But it is me that it has drifted and fallen in, under, swirled in the center and immersed, nestled, held, and meshed, edges of form, pulsating roots lying on my arms and chest. They gradually fuse with my body, my nervous system, eliding with my skin and their plant matter, fibrous cells, gelatinous walls, permeable but viscous, oozing, spreading, settling, bonding. In seeing with my full body, projecting into the world Gray Foy made, I'm absorbed into the living sensations of his hand. An electrical impulse through his arm, to his fingers, the minute pressure and release that became second nature to him, intuitive, like breath work. Tracings of the pencil as pathways of his mind, neural networks like growing and vibrating roots emanating the shapes and tones of the drawing, a touch necessary to shade the edges, to suggest curvature, a message sent through the pencil, pressed into the paper, which yields slightly to etch a shallow crevice within its surface. Graphite residue like spores left in a dense trail. My eyes allied with the rendered roots, they take hold through my chest. I feel them in my breath, my heart rate, my spine, my fingertips. Wiry serpentine growth on the page connects me to Foy. These bundles of root lead my eye in consciousness to his eye and mind across time. A circuit completed, a charge felt. Drawings that entrance, entice, intertwine, hum, move imperceptibly. Slow drawings. Were these drawings Foy's way of holding his place in the world, steady and sure? Had they convinced him that he was still there no matter what unfolded around him or in him? The cultivation of the page, keeping his lungs and heart active, his mind alight. What did he feel in his body as he drew? After he looked at what the hours added up to, what was that? What did it mean to him? What do we do with generous time that we can now give back? Quote, "Most of what I did was from the interior," Foy said. "Not even looking at anything. It just came out of my head like that." His preferred tools were simple, a hard, sharp pencil on untoned white paper. He worked clinically, as a surgeon might, without models, relying on memory. He simply began without sketches, he noted, quote, "from a focused point which develops outward." We just saw several details from this drawing made around 1969. As Foy asserted, there was no living model for what you see. It came out of him at his work table. An earlier drawing, Reconsiderations from 1945, suggests multiple states of consciousness, a body not so much split as proliferate, many selves and aspects of spirit moving free of the physical shell. The central seated figure rests casually, head tilted to the side, a cigarette in his hand. It's clearly Foy, based on his features, though the more we look, we can see that he has played with gender cues, making the body all in fluid. A transparent superimposed figure rises slightly from Foy. Multiple limbs emerge from one another. They reach bodies that drift away, seemingly fully independent. Lines connect his head and arm to sacs that resemble giant abstracted neurons. They grow downward from a slab on the ceiling upon which a prone body lies, in stasis. Is Foy feeding this other body? Is it a future self? Is it a self he tends or keeps in check? Is it his true form? This is complex imagery and is deliberately open-ended, but it suggests that Foy gave credence to spiritualist ideas, altered states, and hidden worlds in his creative process and beliefs. In 1948, he reflected, quote, "I may turn out to be a realist, which isn't so far from my present mood as people might think. After all, hyperrealism actually becomes the supernatural." These threads are everywhere in his work. Presented with this, how did we forget Gray Foy? Who was this artist who drew with such power and sensitivity, who lived fully in the world and then went into his studio to channel his experience through memory and invention? Foy was at the center of things as he started his career in the late 1940s. Where did that lead, and what happened to things, or what happened to bring us to the current exhibition at the Drawing Institute that reintroduces him to the world? Foy was born in Dallas in 1922 and moved with his mother and aunt to Los Angeles at the age of 3. He grew up immersed in reading, learning to garden from his stepfather, and fell in love with theater. In high school and at community college, he did stage design for experimental and classical student productions. His earliest surviving drawings show an acute sensitivity to space and internal scale, a sensibility likely honed by designing for rapt audiences experiencing sound and action emanating from the stage. This drawing, with its emphatic and deep linear perspective, depiction of a spectacular enigmatic event, and anthropomorphic figures, also reveals his quick digestion of the basic techniques of illusionistic surrealism. With his first serious boyfriend, fellow art student and designer Robert Davison, he visited galleries in LA and saw work by Helen Lundberg and Lorser Feidelson, which showed independent responses to surrealism made in California. Surrealism was indeed an important early source for Foy, but it is important to understand where he was seeing it. By 1941, Foy had a subscription to View magazine, published by Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler, which chronicled the interdisciplinary seepage of surrealism into U.S. culture. Foy consumed View enthusiastically, and through it, he learned about new and elastic applications of surrealism's founding ideas. These adjacencies of the present and, through interpretations, the past, played a major role in helping him find his voice in his community. Davison and many of Foy's other friends were drafted to fight in World War II after 1941. Foy was turned away because of severe asthma. To contribute, he worked at the Lockheed Vega aircraft plant in Burbank. He asserted, quote, "I thought since my friends were being shot at, I would do something." Living in California during the war, Foy experienced the anxious atmosphere during blackouts and in seeing anti-aircraft guns along the coast. While working this job at the aircraft plant, he began drawing on office paper such as shipping container forms. Quote, "Drawing was a flight from reality as far as I was concerned. What was going on around me wasn't exactly inspiring, and I withdrew from the world as much as I could," he recalled. Although he tried his hand at oil painting, Foy found it unpleasantly messy and preferred the control, rigor, and sharpness of drawing. Foy's surviving paintings do bear an exacting attention to craft and imaginative imagery. In this 1945 painting on the left, Foy's exploration of stretched and fragmented bodies, minotaur imagery, uncanny form, and fluid space shares a lot in common with the contemporary work of Salvador Dali, such as Uranium and Atomica Melancholia Ideal from 1945. After the war, he returned to Dallas to attend Southern Methodist University during the spring and fall semesters of 1946. Foy felt supported by faculty artists Jerry Bywaters and Otis Dozier, and he exhibited locally to great acclaim. Yet the conservative climate forced him to conceal his identity as a gay man, and everyday attentions took their toll. He visited New York that fall, a trip that convinced him to move there. On a visit to View magazine's offices, he left a drawing with managing editor John Myers. Pavel Chelachev happened to see it and urged Myers to publish it that fall in the 1946 issue of the magazine. It appeared on the verso of a page reproducing Ivan Albright's The Temptation of St. Anthony. This meant the world to Foy. View played a critical role in his emerging sensibility, and he was now seen in relation to these artists that he most admired. It also meant that they were seeing his work, a meaningful step towards acceptance as a peer in their circles. Foy had seen and admired Chelachev's work in View, but in New York, he visited Hide and Seek at the Museum of Modern Art. He could finally stand before it, understand its scale and its full range of color. Foy was entranced by how Chalchev animated double images to illuminate themes of immersion and absorption, and set up analogies between nature and the inside of living bodies. While he made a couple of paintings inspired by Chalchev's interior landscapes, it is in his generative graphite drawings of mysterious plants that he makes the most of what he learned from studying hide and seek. The most elaborate work he had made by this time, Dimensions, originally titled Summary from 1945 to 46, was, according to Foy, an, quote, intense concentration on something that was going on in my head. It just unfolded. It was a very curious performance. This ambitious drawing shows Foy's intensity of focus, boundless sense of invention, and delight in transformation. It was not planned or sketched in advance, but rather evolved gradually from a single point. Quote, I started in the lower right-hand corner, where a hand is touching the arm of a chair, he explained. I wanted to indicate that whatever you touch has a history, that the chair came from a furniture maker, that the furniture maker got it from wood, the wood from trees, end quote. Dimensions reveals Foy's technical skill, but also reveals his design sophistication, an all-over composition that has an internal rhythm driving the imagery. When Foy moved to New York in 1947, he enrolled in further art courses at Columbia University. Among his instructors were Peppino Mangravate. He's Italian, so I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, but he's best known for a wartime painting that's at the Art Institute of Chicago called The Song of the Poet from 1944. And a man named Ralph Meyer, who was dedicated to teaching his students about historical techniques and materials. Foy remembered learning silver point and egg tempera in his course. At the time, there were other programs dedicated to historical experimentation and research with techniques and painting recipes, using pure powdered pigment and making the mixtures themselves. Prominent centers were at Yale, the Art Students League, and at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Incidentally, I'm showing you the palette of Sylvia Fine, who turns 104 this year, and is still active in Martinez, California, and still makes her handcrafted egg tempera painting, and studied with James Watrous at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where there is a recipes and techniques lab. Naturally, for a student who could produce dimensions out of thin air, Foy was chosen to demonstrate to other students in Meyer's classes. Eager to have gallery representation, but not sure where to begin, in early 1948, he brought a portfolio of drawings to Dorothy Miller, Curator of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA. After considering the drawings, she recommended Durlacher Brothers, run by Kurt Askew Jr. The gallery specialized in old master paintings and also living artists working in ways that drew upon earlier techniques. Artists who would be labeled magic realists or neo-romanticists, and some on the edge of the surrealist circle, like Chalchev or Peter Blume, showed there. Charmed by Foy and his work, Askew included him in a group exhibition of drawings with Blume, Stephen Green, Kurt Seligman, Chalchev, and others. These artists became peers, and some developed into close friendships, including Green, who drew this portrait of Foy. 1948 was a turning point for Foy. He met Leo Lerman, the love of his life. Lerman was a writer and editor who contributed to Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and numerous other publications. But that does not get at what who Lerman was. He was a connector of people, a personality, society darling, and raconteur. Through Leo and his association with Durlacher, Foy's world expanded. He was now at the epicenter. Here's actually a photograph of one of the rooms in their apartment, just to give you a sense of how they lived. But Foy was now at the epicenter of overlapping circles of queer culture. Artists, writers, musicians, dancers, photographers, cultural players who he'd admired from afar now wanted to meet him and buy his drawings. Some, including Lincoln Kirstein and Philip Johnson, commissioned portraits from him. The power of and the aspirational longing to be in this community was huge, particularly for queer artists from places where they did not feel safe being themselves. A parallel example is Dudley Hupler from Muscoda, Wisconsin, who began as a writer and started drawing inspired by his friends. He wrote letters to his idols, shrewdly made a postcard set of his drawings, and then hit New York, already known in the circles he longed to be part of. Foy was happy, and he was in his element. He had his first solo exhibition at Durlacher in 1951 and a second one in 1957. Both were well received, and he made sales to significant collectors in some museums. While making his slow, careful drawings, he also did illustration work for magazines, including Mademoiselle, and which is what this is here. This is one of the illustrations he did for Mademoiselle, and also took commissions for album covers and book dust jackets. But by 1966, Durlacher had to move to a smaller space due to waning sales, and by 1967, the gallery had closed, and Foy did not have a new gallery. By 1975, and possibly earlier in the decade, he had stopped making art altogether. He was only 53. He later reflected, quote, "The kind of drawing I did took a lot of quiet and patience, and the household wasn't structured around that sort of life." Foy traveled with Leo, entertained and took care of him. After Leo's death in 1994, he married Joel Kay in 2011, a few months after same-sex marriage became legal in New York. He did not have another exhibition until 6 years after his death in 2018 at Francis Naumann's Gallery in New York. Why has it taken so long to get to know Foy again? One reason is the dominance of a narrow and exclusive modernist canon. The kind of art Foy made was marginalized in criticism that purported to define what mattered in modern art, because it was representational, took a lot of time, and was intimately scaled. It did not fit modernist values defined in his lifetime. A second factor, likely intertwined with the first, was the position of LGBTQ+ artists before Stonewall and pervasive anti-queer attitudes in mainstream American culture. Foy also worked primarily on paper in drawing, and there's still a tendency in the art world to see work on paper as less important than other mediums. Finally, so much of the art world is a commercial system obsessed with value, and criticism, funding, collecting, even museums are caught up in an echo chamber of reinforcing already approved artists and equating large price tags with an artist's eminent stature. Underknown artists are considered a risk. There is a herd mentality in much of the art world, and that means a large percentage of acquisitions and exhibitions and dissertation topics and books will be about what is already familiar. Market pressures can weigh on artists who are hit with messages to produce, to be a brand, to make things for clients. Some artists are using their power of their reputations to push back at this and establish boundaries that allow them to stay true to who they are and prevent exploitation from the market. Njideka Akinyele Crosby, for instance, noted in a New York Times profile earlier this year, quote, "Something I've been very clear about with everybody I work with is, my pace is slow and you cannot push me or force me to work faster." She continued, "I'm not a machine. I like taking my time. Normally, I would have said it takes me about 3 months to make a work, but it's slowly been extending into longer. I've slowed down to get what I need." Foy and so many of his peers would applaud this. Art takes time to see, minutes, also years, generations. These issues are not in the past. They continue to impact reception. In a recent source book for American art, which you see the cover of here, not a single document is associated with or connected to artists who ran in Foy's extended circles, who would have been labeled magic realists. There's no question about what is privileged in the period in which Foy worked, as a recent exhibition at the Royal Academy in London demonstrated. So let's back up 5 years from Foy's 1948 meeting with Miller in order to understand the art world he was positioned in and how he saw himself in it. Miller was one of the organizers of the 1943 MoMA exhibition that gave the term magic realism its currency in American art. Americans 1943, realists and magic realists, appeared at a moment that is often presented at a crossroads. Accounts of the period emphasized the complex mix of circumstances in the mid-1940s that led to what was eventually labeled abstract expressionism. The myth goes, Some artists leapt into abstraction and the avant-garde, while others clung to representation and the past. These binaries have persisted. Realism equals retrograde, abstraction equals innovation, and affect every part of the ecosystem. The American art world at mid-century was messy and exciting, thriving on a volatile mix of methods and subject matter. The pluralist reality of the art scene troubled critic Clement Greenberg, who had commented in 1944, quote, "The extreme eclecticism now prevailing in art is unhealthy and should be counteracted, even at the risk of dogmatism and intolerance." If eclecticism was a modernist sin for Greenberg, MoMA's second iteration in its American series was swollen with demons. Among the 26 contemporary artists included here were Ivan Albright, Peter Blume, Audrey Buehler, Paul Cadmus, Jared French, Ben Shahn, and Andrew Wyeth. I'll be showing you these black and white installation photos from that show during this part. Critics less rigorous and more populist than Greenberg skewered it for stylistic incoherence. Maud Riley, writing in Art Digest, savaged the exhibition, asserting that few, if any, of the artists included practiced realism of any kind and were aberrations by any measure of taste. Confused about whether MoMA intended to identify a new movement, she found the artist's approaches too eccentric and the group too varied to be considered a cohesive trend. Singling out Ivan Albright, she wrote, quote, "And just because it is the most fascinatingly unbelievable thing ever to happen in paint, the way he uses oil colors, to contrive the impossible in graphic delineation, must we call his unburied dead rotting above the ground realism of any kind?" Magic realism was a term that MoMA director Alfred H. Barr Jr. had borrowed from German art historian Franz Roh. He had already used it in labels for MoMA permanent collection installations to describe, quote, "the work of painters who, by means of an exact realistic technique, try to make plausible and convincing their improbable, dreamlike, or fantastic visions." Magic realism seemed to Barr and Miller to be a convenient phrase to describe this broad group of American independents that favored enigmatic imagery delineated with a sharp focus and meticulous attention to detail. This framing also leaned on Roh's binaries, claiming differences between expressionist art and that which came after, Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity. This is reflected in the language often used to discuss many of the American artists. Critic, curator, and cultural impresario Lincoln Kirstein wrote in the catalog that artists, quote, the artists in the show submit to a rigid discipline of almost anonymous manual dexterity, always controlled, never spontaneous. Hence, they are anti-expressionist. They do not greatly exaggerate or distort their subjects, but rather present identical painted equivalents transformed through selective imagination, end quote. According to Kirstein, the artists in the show strove to avoid impressions in favor of completely achieved visual fact. And remember, I'm showing you work that was in that show. These points would become a refrain in Kirstein's later attempts to promote a core group of artists included in the exhibition. This parsing out of method and intention was aimed at distinguishing the artists in American's 1943 from the popular but critically waning European surrealists, who derived their imagery and process from the unconscious. Not surprisingly, American critics had difficulty apprehending the differences between magic realism and the strain of illusionistic surrealism represented by Salvador Dali. A later generation of art historians attempted to clarify these distinctions. Among the most succinct is Jeffrey Wexler, who in the 1980s stressed that, quote, "Magic realism does not invent a new order of things, it simply reorders reality to make it seem alien. Magic realism is an art of the implausible, not the impossible. It is imaginative, not imaginary." An example of what Wexler had in mind is shown in John Wilde's Wilde World, Provincia Naturalica Classicum, a painting through which he explored the complex relationship between place, self, identity, aesthetic influence, and the power of creativity. At first glance, this painting may seem fantastic, full of invention, similar to surrealism, yet each part is carefully based on direct observation from life and photographs. The liberties that Wilde has taken with temporality, space, and with the inclusion of animals not found roaming his home turf in Wisconsin are, as Wexler would say, imaginative. The individual vignettes are possible. After all, Wilde and his friends regularly drew at the Milwaukee Zoo, and he had studied geology and classical architecture. There are no soft monsters tearing themselves apart in the distance, no giraffes on fire. Wilde set eyes on everything he has put in the picture. Wexler's analysis of magic realism as a style 4 decades after the MoMA exhibition reveals the extent to which the museum's survey suggested that it was a school or a movement. Numerous artists labeled with the term rejected it before the exhibition opened. MoMA staff clashed about its title. Director of exhibitions Monroe Wheeler, a close friend of Kirstein, Cadmus, and French, protested the magic realism term and told Barr and Miller they were, quote, straining to revive a precious, unfamiliar terminology to characterize art which is, in any case, extremely variable or heterogeneous. He urged them not to introduce another arbitrary and confusing term to the public and suggested they use surrealism on the basis of its colloquial use in the wider culture. Barr did not wish to participate in what he called the vulgarization of surrealism and asserted that magic realism had a historical relevance and was more precise than the alternative adjectives factual and fantastic that Wheeler had proposed. In her catalog forward, Miller was careful to explain that MoMA did not purport to identify a concerted movement, but chose to examine a phenomenon that had historical roots in America and Europe. MoMA conveyed mixed messages in framing American realists and magic realists. The installation and catalog included a section of 15 19th century American antecedents, plus living contemporaries Edward Hopper and Charles Sheeler, explicitly making a case that magic realism had deep national roots. No less a realist pedigree than Thomas Eakins was assumed to anchor objective fact in the modern work. MoMA's curators selected uncanny examples by Thomas Cole and Raphael Peale, aligning their work with the current realists. Work by the Quaker artist Edward Hicks, known best for his variations on Isaiah's prophecy of a peaceable kingdom, was also included. This provided another lineage for some of the contemporary selections, such as Patrick J. Sullivan, an artist whose work might be considered visionary, but did not strive for the crisp, observable fact that Kirstein and Miller emphasized. What were MoMA's goals with this exhibition and its title? Was this work modern? Was it a movement or just a curious phenomenon? If casual critics found little common ground in these disparate artists, why use the term? MoMA may have felt a responsibility, even authority, to identify isms to be added to the genealogy of modernism that Barr had formed. Americans 1943 was a paradox, presenting a group of independents that confounded expectations and resisted, even violently rejected, stylistic affiliations. Despite MoMA's initial institutional support, and perhaps because of its will to impose cohesion on separate, disparate individuals, American art history has not been generous or even fair to the artists included in that show, or its later revisions curated by Lincoln Kirstein. Just a few years later, in the decade, Ad Reinhardt included many of the artists from the exhibition on the most precariously damaged branch in the modern art family tree. Cadmus, for his part, was plowed under in a field designated for so-called regionalists, and he is right there. It was Kirstein who set out to reclaim and reposition a core group of artists who had been included in Americans 1943 at MoMA. In several exhibitions, essays, and behind-the-scenes efforts, he sought to draw attention to them as alternatives to contemporary art that glorified chance, improvisation, and abstraction. He presented the work publicly in 2 exhibitions of what he called symbolic realism in 1950 and 1952, in New York at the Edwin Hewitt Gallery, and in London at the Institute for Contemporary Art. A third, larger exhibition that he proposed to MoMA was never realized. That would have included over 30 artists, including Gray Foy. Kirstein, as much as Clement Greenberg, and that's Clement Greenberg on the right, looking hard at a Kenneth Nolan painting, is responsible for the critical language around modernist art in the 1940s that began to polarize what was in reality a diverse and fluid art scene. Looking at Kirstein's efforts is instructive, as they show how magic realism came to be understood in the United States. It also explains why Miller would have recommended Durlacher Brothers to Foy, and why Foy would have been seen in that specific context for the rest of his working career. That reception is inseparable from Greenberg's championing of his own subjective preferences in modern art, which ultimately dominated post-war narratives of American modernism. It was a narrative told without Kirstein's group, whether or not it was labeled magic realism. In this period, Kirstein consistently denigrated abstract expressionism and its then leading critical spokesman, Greenberg, for making an art world that valued name brands and personal style. This is what Kirstein believed, over unique, intellectually complex, and carefully made objects. There was too much attention, he believed, paid to how an artist painted, to the means rather than the ends, and how standards for visual artists, let me rephrase that. Kirstein believed there was too much attention at the time paid to how an artist painted, to the means rather than the ends, and low standards for visual artists compared to their peers in other fields, like literature, architecture, and music. Contrasting these fields to art, Kirstein argued that innovations in them occurred with the authority of tradition as a foundation from which individuals expanded and challenged. He charged, quote, "What painting lacks today is what bad painting always lacks: adequate intellectual capacity and manual skill. It is not enough to be able to see, to have personal vision, an original eye, and the ambition to be an artist, and it never has been," end quote. As early as 1940, Greenberg had asserted that realist painters were merely imitating a dominant art form, literature, with the incongruous tools of their chosen medium. In aspiring toward the inherent properties of another art, narrative and description, painters destroyed pure painting, denying what was unique to their practice and leaving it, quote, "perverted and distorted." For Greenberg, this mishandling occurred when painters, quote, "reached such a degree of technical facility as to enable them to pretend to conceal their mediums. In other words, the artist must have gained such power over their materials to annihilate it seemingly in favor of illusion," end quote. Not surprisingly, each critic formed personal collections reflecting their taste and direct support of the artist that they championed. Kirstein on the left, Greenberg on the right. Curiously, Kirstein often underplayed the role of craft in the artists he valued. In his pamphlet essay for the 1950 Symbolic Realism exhibition, and that's a painting by Bernard Perlin that appeared on the cover, it's now in the Princeton Art Museum, he declared that the artists in the exhibition handled their, quote, "medium with enough efficiency to compel our interest in what, rather than how they see. Their work reveals the focus of a vision, neither thumbprint nor handwriting. They tend toward anonymous rendering rather than stylistic idiosyncrasy. Technically, there is no novelty," end quote. Nonetheless, each of the artists on view built intensely personal and idiosyncratic bodies of work, approaching mark-making, color, and light in diverse ways that often confounded their friends and rivals. Kirstein asserted the role of the intellect in this group of artists, emphasizing order, synthesis, and legibility over the, quote, "decorative," the fragmentary, or the improvised. According to him, these artists transform infinities of observable phenomena into parables of universal legibility, rather than inwards toward a limited correspondence. Elsewhere, he asserted that they avoided the self-absorbed introspection he associated with non-objective painters. The nature of the work made by those in Kirstein's orbit contradicted many of these assertions, particularly the suggestion that it was universally legible and not introspective. Those to whom he was closest were Paul Cadmus, Jared French, and George Tooker, shown here in a staged photograph by George Platt Lynes. That's Paul Cadmus. He's working on a painting I'll show you in a minute called What I Believe. George Tooker and Jared French, they did not work together ever. They all worked in individual places, so this is sort of staged to imply kind of this atelier. Cadmus is at work on a worldview painting, What I Believe, made between 1947 and 1948, which presents many friends, family, lovers, and allegorical figures together in a visual celebration of love and life, sensuality, and creativity. It is an inclusive vision, one that Cadmus sought to foster in his lived world. This group formed the nucleus of a sexually open circle in New York that included Lines, Bernard Perlin, Chelachev, Dudley Hupler, Daniel Maloney, and many others who identified as gay or bisexual, if they named their identity at all. Kirstein was married, and they were very well known for taking photographs, particularly at Fire Island. There's George Tooker, Paul Cadmus, Monroe Wheeler, who I mentioned earlier, who worked at MoMA. And then this is a photograph that's a snapshot from a party with George Tooker on the far left, Daniel Maloney, and George Tooker's partner, William Christopher, who was also an artist. Kirstein was married to Cadmus's sister, a dancer and accomplished painter named Fidelma. That's her portrait of Lincoln Kirstein on the left, and that's Cadmus's portrait of his sister on the right. And he was deeply involved in the ballet world with George Balanchine. Foy had relationships with Askew and Philip Johnson, who passed as straight men in their professional lives. John Wilde, a critical part of this moment and group, though in Wisconsin, made numerous erotic drawings in which he was the center of fluid sexualities and desires. These are all paintings that are drawings based on self-portraiture. And Foy, of course, was very much interested in integrating sexuality in his work in numerous ways. Kirstein and many in his circle were deeply invested personally and professionally in sexual culture, though they had to do this discreetly, even corresponding and sharing images with Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey during his research on sexual behavior. Although these artists had no qualms about addressing sexuality in their work, being out, as we think of it today, was profoundly dangerous in Cold War McCarthyite America. Today, the LGBTQ+ community is still asserting the right to be seen and treated with respect and dignity. It's an ongoing human rights issue. Cadmus often included coded gestures and iconography that would be clear to his community. An example of this occurs in Greenwich Village cafeteria, made in 1934 for the WPA, and mischievously integrating folks pushing gender boundaries beyond society's strictures. Tooker's paintings of 1946 and 47 include instances in which he made loosely autobiographical images about being gay in a society that was hostile towards any deviation from an arbitrary set of standards. Children and Spastics, there on the left, echoes the tortures of Christ and Christian martyrs, and was Tooker's expression of compassion and outrage over the persecution of gay men. A Game of Chess, on the right, is Tooker's dramatization of his family's expectations that he marry a woman and the pressures weighing down on his every move by a judgmental society. The stakes were high for mid-century representational artists as abstract expressionism began to dominate critical discourse and the popular imagination. With it came an explicitly hetero, white, tough guy, hard-drinking framing of the work. Jackson Pollock epitomized this in the popular imagination of the time. His spontaneous, intuitive, and physical art was promoted through critical language and photographs as the alpha of New American painting. Artists within Kirstein's circle had no patience, temperament, or interest in this role, and some satirized it, including somebody like Aaron Bohrad, who did this for a cover as a joke for one of his exhibitions at the AAA galleries, and Robert Vickery, who's dramatizing a trance drawing with a child who's so close to it he can't see what he's doing. They dramatized and criticized this in letters and savagely and hilariously satirized it sometimes in their work, but for others, the redirected media attention stung. And though they continued to make strong work, their careers never recovered. Around the same time, Thomas Hart Benton stirred up controversy in the press by complaining that the prevalence of homosexuals, quote, calling the shots in museums and galleries was a problem rife in the art world. With a mixture of sarcasm and anxiety, Dudley Hupler sent newspaper clippings to his friend, artist Gertrude Abercrombie, after Senator Joseph McCarthy and his cohort asserted that homosexuals were scandalously employed in the U.S. government, promising to expose and oust them. These accusations were threatening enough that James Thrall Sobey, a MoMA associate director and curator who was close to Kirstein in his circle, publicly denied Benton's charges in the press about a queer influence in the art world. This cultural climate was just one ingredient in the mix that foregrounded a narrative of heteromasculinity around modernist art. This marginalized figurative artists and rendered magic realists aberrant within the formalist history of post-war modernism. In this context, the critical reception of minutely executed representational art was crafted as the opposite of mural-scaled, improvisatory abstractions, understood to show primal energy in the subconscious. Exclusions and exceptions point to bias in each one of these cases. The abstract expressionist narrative effectively led to exhibitions, collections, and textbooks without women, African-American artists like Norman Lewis, or George Morrison, a Native American practitioner. Kirstein's choices favored gay white men, minimizing BIPOC or women artists he was aware of, or who could have complemented these in his orbit, like Archibald Motley Jr., Eldir Cortor, Messina Barton, or Alice Neal. Greenberg asserted that abstract art, quote, is advanced, creative, evolving, since it corresponds to the truth of contemporary life, while those fitting with Kirstein's circle had rehashed, quote, essentially academic naturalism. Despite their sustained research and experimentation with materials and techniques, Greenberg's logic would argue, materiality was of little concern to this group due to the ends to which they put their materials. Greenberg developed rules of mid-century visibility throughout his writing, emphasized especially in his 1954 essay, Abstract and Representational. There he asserted that abstraction and representation are incommensurate and that synthesis is logically impossible. A painting cannot be fully abstract and convincingly representational. The modes of seeing are too different, requiring a different focus for the eye. Greenberg's conclusion was that, quote, the most ambitious and effective pictorial art of these times is abstract, or goes in that direction. Both Kirstein and Greenberg held extreme views about what mattered in modern painting, and which artists best represented a productive future for American art. Yet in staking out their respective viewpoints, each dramatically overlooked qualities that their chosen artists shared. Among the most curious and unaddressed aspects of mid-century modernist realism is the degree to which it elided abstraction and realism in defiance of Greenberg's will to impose dogma on a messy art world and Kirstein's determination to ignore the impenetrable chaos in much of the work he championed. Indeed, the artist moved in the direction of abstraction rather than naturalism with an intensity that conveyed psychological and social tensions of the era. The work of many of these so-called magic realists foregrounds an accretion of mark-making and layering. You can see it in several of Foy's drawings, including this mysterious cityscape framed by a window, or in the way he embeds bodies in the fecund, abundant overgrowth of nature, and in the meditative marks that make up so many of his fungi drawings. The work carries the lived, immersive fact of labor in its form and design. Several push emphatically away from crisp clarity through their additive processes and teeter on the brink of chaos and entanglement. In this way, artists like Foy engage new approaches to realism that reveal a dialogue between abstraction and representation. There is no mistaking them for work of another era. Some work that seems rigorously and traditionally composed grew entirely out of automatist and improvisational methods. This was the origin of Peter Blume's The Rock, which you see here, made between 1945 and 48, which had a complex evolution centered on trauma and Blume's turn to spontaneous drawing as a way to find his imagery and the underlying structure of the large composition. He started after being unable to work for several months by doing automatic drawing like these, which developed into this, which developed into what you see on that canvas stitched together with paper, and then he improvised it without an underdrawing in the end, which became that. And I think it shows in the way that this comes across when you see it, that it's not rigorously designed, that it had this spontaneous under this background. Some work of the period, like this one, shows a tension between body and mark making that resulted in bold juxtapositions of depicted surfaces. It reveals just how much Kirstein's group understood abstract painting's new configuration of space, depth, pattern, and the relationship between surface and meaning. In this painting, The Farewell from 1952, by Bernard Perlin, painted in Italy, he depicted the woods near Lake Albano. The dense trees form the setting for the end of Perlin's relationship with his lover, Konstanty Aleksander Jelensky, the Polish writer and essayist who left Perlin for artist Lenore Fini. The two figures on the far left represent Jelensky and Fini walking away from Perlin, who moves slowly toward the right side of the woods. There is an anxious twitching quality to the predominantly bare trees, as though they are silently weeping or wading in emotional turmoil. The trunk of a tree just above Perlin's body rhymes with his silhouette, suggesting that the forest began to absorb and echo his sadness. An infinity of branches, the dense interstices of entangled trees emerging from the blood-red soil, suggests further bodily analogies with the surrounding environment. Nerve bundles, endings, receivers all come to mind as the electrified shimmer of the spooked woods. Between Bernard Perlin and Kott, there is space and overgrowth, thickets upon thickets blocking a path to reunion. The Farewell is a kind of painting that Greenberg would have disparaged, yet the manner in which he discusses space and the relationship of the viewer to pictorial space in the period resonates with Perlin and other so-called magic realist work. In his 1948 essay, The Crisis of the Easel Picture, Greenberg identified a tendency towards surface uniformity in recent painting as progressive and sophisticated. For him, this signified a problematic but important development in the history of modernist painting that reflected contemporary experience more adequately than pictures composed with a hierarchical design strategy. Greenberg wrote that in this advanced stage, quote, "The all-over painter renders every element and every area of the picture equivalent in accent and emphasis, sometimes so unobtrusive that at first glance we might see in the result not equivalence, but a hallucinatory uniformity. The dissolution of the pictorial into sheer texture, into apparently sheer sensation, into an accumulation of repetitions, seems to speak for an answer something profound in contemporary sensibility." Read alongside contemporary works by the realist Greenberg consistently rejected, this passage shows the futility of abstract representational binaries. In several of these works, the world is turned inside out and the viewer is unnaturally, supernaturally brought close to matter. Yet matter is multiplied to the point where it is difficult to apprehend as volume and weighty form. Instead, it becomes a textured mass of color, shape, or line. So too, it is limiting to see Foy only in relation to artists of the Surrealist circle or those in Kirstein's orbit. I'm showing you details of that drawing I just had on the screen. In his later drawings in particular, like this one, the tendency towards meditative mark making, leading to heightened states of awareness or even altered states, has much in common with contemporary mescaline drawings of Henri Michaud. The breeding mass of lines that creates a mesh of motion can be found in passages of Foy's work as well, giving the same organic quality to his depicted objects. That tendency to make repetitive marks in dense accretions of graphite to mimic the substance of nature also has much in common with Jean Dubuffet's texturology series, in which the artist used a range of different techniques to make an equivalent of soil, rock, sand, and other aspects of the earth. Together, Foy's work and that of so-called representational artists can be dense, multi-layered, and extremely difficult to decipher even after the eye has adjusted to their surface. The animation and profusion of material puts it into another realm. Some rely on formal language of abstraction, embodied in extreme realism, as the underlying artistic method. By emphatically asserting surface patterns through an excessive accretion of detail, many of the artists in Kirstein's circle, including Foy, simultaneously enabled illusionistic tangibility and a syncopated formal rhythm. This strategy, achieving a perceptually impossible realism through abstraction, would appear to be a formalist paradox. It was, however, a parallel modernist strategy. Mutually intent on defining a particular path to progressive art and a standard of quality, both Greenberg and Kirstein missed the common ground among artists of this period. Looking closely, we see that the work resists Kirstein's primacy of ideas over formalism and Greenberg's rejection of illusionistic space. Gray Foy is gone, but his work lingers. We meet him across time through it. What if we thought of artists like stones dropped into the world, making ripples that radiate outward in expanding concentric rings? They glide in all directions, are not linear, and they even double back when they reach the outer edge. Multiply that by millions, and we're all in relation to one another. We make choices, can reinforce silences in the archive, make gaps larger between people and ideas. We can also make connections, allow edges to touch, put people together from past and present to enhance what we share. When Foy died in 2012, the New York Times obituary opened with a description of a vision Foy had of his wake. Quote, "The line began at his apartment door, extended down 5 flights of stairs to the lobby, threaded out the entrance to his building at 57th Street and 7th Avenue, and stretched along 57th as far as the eye could see, a strand of patient, ghostly, often anonymous visitors that snaked down the centuries, everyone whose history suffused any of the thousands of antiques in Gray Foy's Manhattan home." End quote. Foy believed things retained the personalities of their histories. He imagined the makers and previous owners of objects he cared for honoring him. But what if that vision was actually us, the admirers and audience he could never know, in the future, today and tomorrow, queuing up to wonder at his drawings, to connect across time, to assure him that we'll be here even when he has moved on? I think it was. Thanks.
So if you raise your hand, I've got a mic here.
Okay.
Okay.
The very first image that you began with, that close-up detail, and then some of the later images from the 70s, it looks like, they looked to me extremely kind of microscopic in nature. That's at first what I thought we were looking at. Was there any kind of larger scientific influence on this later work, or is it really that more surreal?
So sorry, I was just going to go back to that so everybody could see what you're talking about, but Tony has to do it. Thank you, Tony. You know, I don't know enough about the other aspects of Foy's training or interest or what he was reading to know the degree to which he was engaged in, like, you know, scientific things. There's actually somebody here who wrote the book, so maybe he knows. But, you know, I think among a lot of these folks, a lot of this generation, you know, like John Wilde, for instance, in his house in Evansville, Wisconsin, it was on acres of land where he had like his own arboretum, and he would regularly take walks around and pick up dead things. You know, he'd pick up dead birds, or he'd pick up fungus, or he kept a chart that for decades that showed that basically was like when the first particular plants or fruit or vegetables or animals returned after the winter. He would chart the day that happened. That's in his Archives of American Art. They were, a lot of these folks, even Bernard Perlin, you know, he lived in Connecticut in a house that was like in nature. George Tooker and Jared French and Paul Cadmus wound up moving from Manhattan, from Brooklyn to Vermont, to Heartland, Vermont, and built houses there. You know, they were in the landscape, and they were very attuned to the seasons and how things were growing. They were growing their own food. And so part of it is this, I think, this emphasis on being in relation to the world and being attuned with what's happening and being like connected to it, that was really important for a lot of these people, and I imagine it was important for Foy too. You know, in his biography, in the biography in the book, in the chronology in particular, you know, it mentions early on that when he's in LA, his stepfather is gardening, and Foy very early on helps him with that and learns about gardening. And so there's probably just picking up a lot of like what the rhythms are and how things are growing and what things look like and all the different sort of morphology of this stuff. So I'm not sure how scientific it was as so much it was really wanting to know about the world and getting into it. I don't know, about all these fungi drawings and drawings that seem to be influenced by seeing a wide range of mushrooms and things that are decomposing other objects while they're growing and living in the woods. But Foy seems to have been really, really interested in this stuff to the point where he could internalize it and be convincingly sort of drawing it from memory. But the fellow who's here, I don't want to put you on the spot, but may know more about that than I do in terms of his scientific interests or reading. Other questions? Yes, Sandra.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I wanted to pick up one of the threads that you were discussing, or maybe expand that thread to do with queer MoMA, which I think has a lot of legs that I'm really interested in, and how you think that might, in many different departments at MoMA in the 40s, there were a lot of gay men working, and how that might have affected the history of modernism, or why didn't magic realism, since there were, as Thomas Hart Benton was complaining, a lot of, I think he called them curator boys, and James Thurl Sobey went and defended, MoMA and MoMA's staff, but I'm just kind of trying to think about, like, how does that intersect? Why don't we know more about magic realism and the tastes of these queer curators? Why did Clement Greenberg's, like they had the institutional power behind them in a way, and yet remained the magic realism, as you've so kind of beautifully drawn out and described, like magic realism did not become a mainstream or legitimate avant-garde.
Right. Who-wee. That's
Sorry, I don't even know if that's a question. I just want you to elaborate on that.
It's something that has been on my mind for a long time. I mean, it's kind of omnipresent. I'm trying to get to the picture of the pajama photograph, which it's not people in pajamas. It's people. That's the first names, the first couple letters of the names of the people taking these photographs. There it is. Okay, so. As I mentioned, that's George Tooker. This is Paul Cadmus. Jared French is probably taking the photograph. I can't remember. And that's Monroe Wheeler, who was the guy who was complaining about using the terminology. He worked at the Museum of Modern Art. There was a lot of the folks in this circle, including Kirstein, who was curating exhibitions and was responsible for the beginning of the Latin American collection at MoMA. He was going to South America and doing studio visits and sourcing the material that would be the foundation of MoMA's Latin American collection, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, big collection of modernism from Latin America at American Museum. And these people had huge amounts of influence, like Sandra said, and were interconnected. I don't know, there's lots of different sort of reasons why then abstract expressionism becomes the thing that captivates the minds of audiences and is on Life magazine and Time magazine, is on the cover of Art News and suddenly takes off and is dominating the market. Maybe part of it is that politically, I mean, I'm not sure if this is the cart before the horse, but the State Department used abstract art as a way to promote the idea that American democracy fostered freedom and freedom of expression. And you could do this. This is what you could do in the United States, and sent these touring exhibitions of this kind of material off. So maybe it was also politically expedient to have this kind of thing represent, what the triumph of American painting was. There's so much weird nationalistic self-definition happening right after the Second World War too, that is about who are we? You know, if we're the superpower, also maybe culturally we need to be the superpower. And so what is the thing that seems to be uniquely American that sprung up? Of course, abstract expressionism has lots of threads that come from lots of other places. It doesn't just, you know, come out of somebody's head like Athena coming out of the skull of Zeus or something like that. You know, there's things that are behind it, including surrealism. You know, at the time, you know, jazz could be legitimately promoted as the main kind of major American cultural form because it certainly starts here because of black people, because of African Americans. It is a homegrown, genuinely avant-garde American music form. And there's a lot of analogies between abstract expressionism and spontaneity and improvisation at the time. It's harder to see those kinds of connections between this kind of picture and abstract expressionism. So maybe part of that is all kind of in the mix. You know, I'm not sure, but in terms of going back to your question about a queer influence at MoMA, I'm sure that a lot of this material entered the collection quietly, in part because of an influence of folks who knew what they were looking at and got Barr and Miller to acquire it, or had patrons like Nelson Rockefeller buy some of this stuff. But it's something that I think is in need of more research and is a great, you know, topic for lots of maybe your students to pick up, because it's there and it's probably not just at MoMA. So I think it's something that still probably we could do a lot about, but you know, I'm not sure. I really have I have been working on these artists and care about these artists for a long time, and it's hard to really sort of figure out why one took off so much. And part of it is that there were so many writers who were writing about it. Some of them didn't quite understand it, but they were writing about it and promoting it. Everybody from Thomas Hess to somebody like Harold Rosenberg, who had a completely different take on why abstract expressionism was important, which was more tied to existentialism. But Greenberg, you know, also overlooked a lot of Europeans who were working in ways that were abstract, like Dubuffet or, you know, other folks. He just didn't want to include them. And so I'm not sure, Sandra, do you have ideas?
I'm trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.